you, Chairman Nadler. Mr. Whitaker, thank you for being here today. Last year, FBI Director Christopher Wray came before this committee and stated that no one is above the law. You would agree with that statement, wouldn't you?
I would. In fact, there is a Time magazine.
Thank you. Well, good.
Covers in my office.
Thank you. You don't have to keep saying it. Thank you. You haven't taken any sort of a loyalty oath to Donald Trump, have you?
No, I have not taken any loyalty.
Have you signed any non-disclosure agreement with the White House or Donald Trump?
We signed our ethics pledge, which was the most robust ethics pledge, but I haven't signed any other documents other than the normal DOJ employment document.
And there was no non-disclosure agreement with anything you signed, correct?
I don't believe so, but I don't know what the standard DOJ forms are.
In fact, the only thing you really had to do before you could assume your current position was take an oath to the United States Constitution. Isn't that right?
I proudly took the oath for the second time when I came back to the Department of Justice.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions about the U.S. Constitution that you can easily answer yes or no. And the first question is, there is no sentence in the Constitution that states that the President's National Security Advisor can't be indicted, correct?
Congressman, as is consistent with the practice of the Department of Justice, we investigate crimes and we prosecute individuals that commit crimes.
Just asking a simple question. I'll go on. There's no sentence in the U.S. Constitution that states the President's former campaign chairman can't be indicted, correct?
Same answer to your previous question.
Does that sentence exist in the Constitution?
Of course it does not, Congressman.
That's
you know that, and I know that.
Right, because Paul Manafort was indicted. There is no sentence in the Constitution that says the President's children can't be indicted, correct?
Congressman, you can give me the whole list. I mean, sort of.
No, I'll give you three more.
Okay.
Yeah, right?
There is no sentence in the United States Constitution that says that the President's children cannot be indicted.
There's no sentence in the U.S. Constitution that says the Vice President can't be indicted, correct?
That's correct.
Right. There's no sentence in the U.S. Constitution, this is my last one, there's no sentence in the U.S. Constitution that says the sitting President of the United States cannot be indicted, correct?
Congressman, because that is the opinion of the Office of
I don't actually care what DOJ policy is. I'm asking about the Constitution.
With the practices of the Department
Mr. Whitaker,
of Justice
it's just a yes or no question.
Years.
Mr. Whitaker, I'm asking you a factual.
Under both administrations.
After this hearing, you can spin the Constitution all you want. As you sit here today, you just have to answer a factual yes or no question. I'm going to make it even easier for you. There's no sentence in the Constitution that says, quote, the sitting President of the United States cannot be indicted, unquote. Correct?
Congressman,
yes or no?
As you know, I would refer you
right here.
I have a copy myself.
Right. So is that sentence in this Constitution? It's not, correct? I'm not trying to trick you. It's not a hard question.
I don't. Again,
it's a founding document of our federal government. Is that sentence in this Constitution?
Congressman, you and I both know that the way that the OLC opinion is written,
I'm asking about the Constitution,
the founding question as to why the President of the United States,
asking about the Constitution,
sitting President of the United States, can't be indicted.
I'm just going to, Mr. Chair, I'm just going to submit the U.S. Constitution for the record and say, no, that sentence is not in there. Now we're going to move on. Earlier today, you had testified that you did not communicate to Donald Trump or senior White House advisors about the special counsel's investigation. So I'm going to ask you a related question. Did you communicate to Donald Trump or any senior White House advisors about investigations from the Southern District of New York concerning the Trump Organization, the Trump Inaugural Committee, Michael Cohen, or other investigations that relate to Trump entities or potentially the president?
Congressman, I mentioned that I said other investigations in my opening statement. I really don't have anything further to add to that answer.
And when you said other investigations, you mean you communicated to the president about other investigations? No,
I didn't. That's not what I said in my opening statement. I'll refer you back to my opening statement. I was very clear.
Did you communicate to the president and any senior White House advisors about investigations from the Southern District of New York related to Trump entities?
Again, I was very explicit in my opening statement as to that, not only about my communications regarding the special counsel's office, and I said other investigations, and the Southern District of New York would be included in investigations.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to move to another subject. The president has talked about national emergency. Under the latest FBI data, it's correct, isn't it, that violent crime across the United States has gone down?
Yeah, we celebrate actually that violent crime has gone down in the last 2 years.
Property crime has gone down as well, isn't that right?
Congressman, as I sit here right now, I believe generally all crime is down over the last 2 years.
And then my last question.
Trump was elected.
Sure. My last question to you is, you would agree with Donald Trump, wouldn't you, when last year he tweeted out that border crossings are at a 45-year low?
We saw a precipitous decline in border crossings after the president was elected and sworn into office. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to retain those gains, and we've seen an absolute dramatic surge in family units.
Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Whitaker, before you took the call from President Trump, you had a fascinating career. Owned a daycare center, a concrete supply business, trailer sales, GOP activist, U.S. attorney who unsuccessfully prosecuted Iowa's first openly gay state legislator on trumped-up Hobbs Act charges that were dismissed by the jury in about an hour, Senate candidate. There have been some scandals, too. Here's one. Trump's acting attorney general involved in firm that scammed veterans out of life savings. Veteran says, I spent the money on a dream. I lost everything. But the newspapers say you struck gold when you arrived in Washington, which the president calls the swamp. Here's one that tells the story. Conservative nonprofit with obscure roots and undisclosed funders paid Matthew Whitaker $1.2 million. According to the Washington Post, in the 3 years after he arrived in Washington, Whitaker received more than $1.2 million as the leader of a charity that reported having no other employees. That's a pretty good deal. Now, what was the name of the charity that you ran, Mr. Whitaker?
Congressman, you've mentioned a lot in your...
no, but I'm asking you a very specific question. What was the name of the charity?
You have challenged my character.
No, I'm asking you a question. I control this time, Mr. Whitaker. If you want to ask the chairman for time of your own, you can do it. This is my time. Mr. Whitaker, you don't run this committee. You don't run the Congress of the United States, and you don't run the Judiciary.
Gentleman will suspend. The gentleman is correct. The witness will answer the questions, and it's up to the gentleman to decide what questions. The gentleman will continue. We'll resume.
What was the title of the not-for-profit that you ran?
What time period, sir?
What was the last title? I know it changed its name 3 different times, right? What was the final name?
While I was employed as the executive director, it was called the Foundation for Accountability and Civic Trust.
Did you name it?
I did. Actually, you know...
Those are highly noble goals, accountability and civic trust. So let's talk about some accountability and civic trust. Mr. Whitaker, I've got a question for you.
No, you asked me a question.
I asked you a question. I control the floor, Mr. Whitaker. You don't understand.
The gentleman is correct. The gentleman controls the time, and if he wishes, as many members have done on occasion, they make a statement, they don't even ask a question, but if he wishes to proceed to another question, it's his time.
But Congressman, I do not feel, Mr. Chairman, I do not feel like my answer would be complete on the record.
It's up to the
question he asked. Okay,
Mr. Whitaker, see if you can get into this. Tell us where the money came from that you were paid, the $1.2 million that you were paid before you went to the Department of Justice. I'm asking my question.
Mr. Chairman, point of order, which overrules your question. Point of order.
The gentleman will explain his point. The gentleman will suspend. The gentleman will state his point of order.
Look, we're going to go down this probably many more times, but again, if you wanted to do a confirmation hearing, this is not under the scope of this hearing. This is not a confirmation hearing, and is not shown to be a...
Mr. Chairman, this goes to...
The gentleman's point of order is not well taken. The gentleman, the gentleman from Maryland has the discretion to ask the questions. The gentleman will proceed.
Appeal the ruling of the chair.
The gentleman has appealed the ruling of the chair. The gentlelady has moved to table. All in favor of the motion to table the appeal of the ruling of the chair will vote aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Aye. The ayes have it. The ruling of the motion is tabled.
Mr. Chairman, can you and I engage in a colloquy?
The gentleman will...
Can we suspend the clock and you and I engage in a colloquy?
We're in the middle of the...
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. Is the ranking member just going to continue to interrupt when he doesn't like the flow of questions?
Excuse me.
I'll probably make a point of order when that needs to be made. Right now,
good if it'd be useful if it was actually a point of order.
Everyone will please suspend. The gentleman made a point of order. It was ruled out of order. Right now, the gentleman has the time. If the ranking member wants to make a point, I'll recognize him after the gentleman is completed. The gentleman will resume.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been reported publicly that there was one donor And as we understand it, I think you're testifying today that you were the sole employee of the group. So there was one donor and one employee. Do you know who the donor was to the group that funded your salary for $1.3 million?
Yes, I do.
Who was the donor?
The donor was another nonprofit 501c3 organization called the Donors Trust.
Okay, now that was the pass-through vehicle, but who reached into their pocket and wrote the check to go through that to pay your salary?
Congressman, as you know, because you've looked at this issue, the Donors Trust is much bigger than the Foundation for Accountability and Civic Trust and raises millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars every year. I actually, as I sit here today, have no idea who the donors to Donors Trust that then funded the foundation.
All right, well then I've got a theory that I want to float with you, and it goes to something very strange that's been happening at the Department of Justice recently. A casino billionaire and magnate Sheldon Adelson hates online gambling for obvious reasons. It's competition for him. He wants people in the casinos, not online. And he spent more than $1 million lobbying Congress to override a 2000 opinion by the Office of Legal Counsel at DOJ saying that the Wire Act plainly prohibits only sports gambling online, not gambling in the states, which is why Florida, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, lots of states have built important businesses for themselves online. But Congress wouldn't change the law according to the demands of Mr. Adelson. So rather than change the law, he decided to try to get the Department of Justice to change the interpretation of the law. And he threw millions into a campaign to remake the DOJ and get the Office of Legal Counsel to perform a complete reversal and say that the Wire Act bans the kinds of lotteries that states run online, even though its language plainly prohibits only sports betting. And when Donald Trump won and Mr. Sessions became AG and you became chief of staff, DOJ leadership ordered a reevaluation of this legal question, and what do you know? The Office of Legal Counsel found some subtle and invisible points of law that apparently escaped the Department of Justice back in 2011, and it reversed the plain reading of the interpretation, which talks specifically about sports betting. Now, were you involved in that decision?
Congressman, the General Sessions was recused at the time that decision came out.
So were you recused too?
I was recused, and so I was not involved in that decision.
Did you ever talk to Sheldon Adelson about it?
No, I've actually never met Sheldon Adelson.
Okay, did you talk to any of his lobbyists about it?
No, I did not.
Did you talk to Charles Cooper about it?
No, but I do know Charles Cooper, and I would point out one of the things, Mr. Rath.
Well, look, if you can ask the chairman for time, but I can't give you my time. Forgive me, we only have 5 minutes.
OLC opinion came out.
The gentleman controls the time. At the conclusion of his statement,
is the chairman not wanting the witness to give full answers?
At the conclusion of his 5 minutes, I will afford the witness some time, but the gentleman controls the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In January and February of 2018, the chairman and vice chairman of Wild Rose Casino and Resorts, a casino in Iowa, each donated $2,600 to your Senate campaign, which was over 4 years before when you lost that campaign. How did these casino operators come to donate to your campaign several years after you lost? Did you talk to them?
Time of the gentleman has expired. The witness may answer the question.
To answer your question specifically, no, I did not. To go back to the other point I'd like to make, Congressman, is that the first OLC opinion that preceded the one we just issued in November was done, and the state of Illinois provided a white paper regarding the position on the Wire Act. And so I think it is very consistent, and your inference that somehow that process was corrupted or corrupt is absolutely wrong, and the premise of your question I reject.
Gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Whitaker, thank you for being with us. Our country is still reeling from the horrors of family separation that occurred at the border. I was the first member of Congress to talk to hundreds of women and men who had been ripped apart from their children. I went into a federal prison to talk to those women. Many of them had not even been able to say goodbye to their children. They sat in the room next door as they heard their children yelling for them, and they were not able to go and speak to their children. And for weeks, they didn't know where their children were. Most of these women, most of the men, were seeking asylum. And your department, instead of allowing them their legal right to seek asylum, your department instead imposed a zero humanity policy to prosecute them in mass proceedings, resulting in the U.S. government tearing thousands of children from their moms and dads, and this is still happening. And the truth is, we may not know how many children were separated from their parents. So, Mr. Whitaker, you were Attorney General, former Attorney General Jeff Sessions' Chief of Staff at the time. Is that correct?
Of the zero tolerance policy being implemented?
You were his Chief of Staff at the time.
At what point in time? I was
of the family separation policy. Let me just tell you, you
I'm sorry,
were.
there was no family separation policy. There was a zero tolerance policy.
This has been given 4 Pinocchios multiple times. I'm just going to tell you, you were former Attorney General's Chief of Staff at the time. Last month, Senator Merkley released a leaked draft memo by senior officials at the Department of Justice and Homeland Security outlining policies to separate children from their families. Were you aware of this memo at the time?
No.
So as the Chief of Staff, you were not aware of what your boss was doing?
Was the memo, I'm sorry, are you talking about the leaked memo or the memo that General Sessions issued?
There was a leaked draft memo by senior officials at the Department of Justice. You were the Chief of Staff. I would think you would know, and you would be a senior official, you would know about that memo. The memo stated that a policy of criminally prosecuting parents would require close coordination between DHS and the Department of Health and Human Services, which would be tasked with housing children separated from their moms and dads. And yet a report released by the Government Accountability Office last October says that DHS and HHS were, quote, unaware that your former boss's zero tolerance prosecution policy memo was coming. Is it correct that the Department of Justice provided no advance notice to those departments?
Congresswoman, the department's policy.
It's just a yes or no. Did you provide advance notice to those departments?
We conducted a press conference in San Diego with the head of the Immigration Customs Enforcement when we announced the zero tolerance policy. And all the zero tolerance policy does is says that we will take all referrals from DHS. I'm
just going to stop you right there because it is my time. According to the GAO report, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, report on family separation, DHS and HHS officials told us the agencies did not take specific planning steps because they did not have advance notice of the Attorney General's April 2018 memo. It went on to say specifically, CBP, ICE, and ORR officials stated that they became aware of the April 2018 memo when it was announced publicly. So before or after the zero, and actually let me go back. Are you saying that CBP, ICE, and ORR lied to the GAO and that they were somehow aware and given advance notice?
No, I'm not going to suggest not telling the truth. I'm saying that when we publicly announced the zero tolerance policy, it was pursuant to a public event in San Diego.
And so prior to the public event, Mr. Whitaker, prior to the public event, these ICE, CBP, and ORR officials told the GAO that they had not gotten any notice. I'm not talking about once it was public. I'm talking about whether there was advance notice. Let me go on. Before or after the zero tolerance policy was put into place, and I call it the zero humanity policy, did the U.S. attorneys track when they were prosecuting a parent or legal guardian who had been separated from their child? There's only one answer to this. It's gone through the courts.
You know, did we track it?
Did you track when you were prosecuting a parent or legal guardian who had been separated from a child?
I don't believe we were tracking that.
You were not tracking it. That is the correct answer. And when parents are prosecuted and sentenced, they are in DOJ custody, correct?
Correct. Their custody is transferred to the U.S. Marshals.
So these parents were in your custody. Your attorneys are prosecuting them, and your department was not tracking parents who were separated from their children. Do you know what kind of damage has been done to children and families across this country? Children who will never get to see their parents again. Do you understand the magnitude of that?
I understand that the policy of zero tolerance.
Has the Justice Department started tracking parents and legal guardians who were separated from their children at the border?
The time of the gentlelady has expired. The witness may answer the question.
Congresswoman, I appreciate your passion for this issue, and I know that you've been very involved on the front lines of this.
This is about more than my passion. This is about the children's future, Mr. Whitaker. Please answer. Go ahead, please.
The witness may answer.
Congresswoman, the responsibility for the arrest, the detention, and together with the custody of the children was handled by DHS and HHS before those people were ever transferred to DOJ custody through the U.S. Marshals.
Thank you. The time of the gentlelady has expired. Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Whitaker, I spent 27 years in law enforcement. I served as the chief of police. I took an oath just like you did, and I took that oath very, very seriously to uphold the Constitution and to protect this country from all enemies, foreign and domestic. I hope you took the oath that you took very, very seriously. But today, as I've sat through, and my colleagues right, this has been painful because I believe that you have worked to make our criminal justice system, to make a mockery out of it. And it's painful for me for you to do that, and anybody up to and including the President of the United States. But let me ask you this, and it's really been painful for someone who has been given so much responsibility, representing the men and women who have dedicated their lives to public service. That really means a lot to me. I hope it means a lot to you. Mr. Liu asked you if you ever prove it. Mr. Liu asked you if you ever communicated with President Trump about investigations in the Southern District of New York. Instead of answering, you referred him back to your statement. Referred him back to what was written for you. But all you said is that you didn't make any, or statement that you didn't make any promises or commitments to President Trump. I want to know whether you talked to President Trump at all about the Southern District of New York's case involving Michael Cohen.
Congresswoman, as I've mentioned several times today, I am not going to discuss my private conversations with the President of the United States.
So yes or no, did you?
No matter what the question is.
Yes or no, did you discuss with the President Trump anything about Michael Cohen?
Congresswoman, as I have expressed several times today, I am not.
Did you ever have any conversations with the President about firing or reassigning any personnel, U.S. attorneys or others who work with the Southern District of New York? With the President or anybody at all? Did you ever have any conversations with anybody about reassigning or firing any personnel, including U.S. attorneys with the Southern District of New York?
Congresswoman, I sit on top of the Department of Justice, as you mentioned.
Did you ever have any conversations about anybody who works with the District of Virginia firing or reassigning? With anybody, not just the President, anybody at all?
Congresswoman, I am not going to talk.
Okay, so let's talk about the great 115,000 men and women who work for the Department of Justice, because I agree that they, is your words, extremely talented, highly principled public servants who are dedicated to upholding our great Constitution and the laws of the United States. I'm sure you're familiar with this because you keep up. At a rally last fall, the President said, look what's being exposed at the Department of Justice and the FBI. You have some real bad ones. You see what's happening at the FBI. They're all gone. They're all gone, but there is a lingering stench, and we're going to get rid of that too. Do you agree with the President's characterization of the Department of Justice and the FBI? As the Attorney General, please tell me why you would agree or why you would not agree with that statement.
Congresswoman, since I've become the acting Attorney General, I have reestablished a positive relationship between the Department of Justice and the White House.
Before you established that positive relationship, what was your opinion of the 115,000 men and women who dedicate their life to public service? Before you had your current position, what was your opinion of them?
I have actually a very high estimation of the men and women at the Department of Justice. They are the most exceptional, hardworking people that I have ever.
So you disagree with the President's characterization because they don't deserve it, Mr. Whitaker, and you are here. You supervise, you manage them. You don't agree with the President's characterization of them. Is that correct?
Listen, before, Congresswoman, in all due respect, I feel very strongly that as the acting Attorney General of the United States, that I have to set the tone for the entire Department of Justice. And what is so important—
If I worked for you, Mr. Whitaker, and you thought I was highly principled and very talented, and that was your answer when I was asked, or you're asked about how do you view the people who work for you, that's your answer, that's pretty pitiful. Let me ask you this. You've only mentioned drugs coming through the southern border, the problem at the southern border as characterized by you and the president. Could you please paint a picture of drugs flowing through our ports of entry? Because I'm told the overwhelming number or percentage of drugs that flow into our country come through the ports of entry. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? And if so, yes or no, why not?
The time of the gentlelady is expired. The witness may answer the question.
Congresswoman, we actually both agree. The ports of entry at our southern border are most trafficked with drugs and illegality. It also comes in between ports.
Overwhelming of drugs come through the ports of entry. Do you
on our southern border, yes.
Agree or disagree with that?
I believe that a tremendous amount of drugs come through our ports of entry on the southern border, yes.
The gentlelady, sorry, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, sir. Wanted to ask you about your enforcement priorities. One of my jobs here in Congress is to serve on the Department of Homeland Security, and within that job, one of my most important critical jobs is to make sure our citizens are safe, to protect our nation against terrorist threats. In May of 2017, a joint FBI-DHS bulletin warned of a growing threat of violence posed by white supremacists, neo-Nazis, right-wing extremists, and other white nationalist groups. An extensive study of terrorist plots between 2008 and 2016 found that plots and attacks by white nationalist groups in the U.S. outnumbered the threats by Islamic extremists 2 to 1. White supremacist groups have been aggressively recruiting in our college campuses, and violent incidents involving these groups have more than tripled since 2017. More than 100 people have been killed or injured since 2014, and more than 60 in 2017 alone by these alt-right groups. Sir, just very basic question. Do you believe that white nationalism, white supremacists, extremists, or right-wing groups in this country pose a threat?
Yes, I do.
Is it growing?
Based on that report issued by the FBI, I have no reason, as I sit here today, to disagree with it.
Do you believe that the administration is placing enough of an emphasis, enough resources allocated, dedicated to stopping these kinds of homegrown terrorist attacks?
I believe that we are dedicating resources to the appropriate threats. That is done obviously below my role. It's done mostly at the line and the management level at the FBI and our other agencies, including our partners at DHS, as you mentioned. And I really, as I sit here today, I think we are adequately addressing the threats that we face, but we are always reallocating resources based on how those threats evolve.
Adequately addressing the threat, and you mentioned earlier in your opening statement 30 convictions, hate crime convictions. Yet in 2017, an increase of 17% hate crimes reported, which they're usually underreported in this country. More than 7,000 hate crimes in 2017, and you have 30 convictions. Do you think you're allocating adequate resources towards prosecuting hate crimes?
I do, and if you look at some of the high-profile cases we've done, like the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh or the Charlottesville situation that we previously discussed, or even the case where we sent a prosecutor to my home state of Iowa to help prosecute a state hate crime, I think we have addressed hate crime.
If you look at the number, 7,000 reported, almost 20% increase in 2017, 30 convictions. Adequate?
Congressman, we always work with our state partners and the local police to determine where is the best place and the most effective place to prosecute a crime. And so to suggest that somehow that those victims of those crimes don't receive the proper justice, I think would be
I think I'm looking at it from relative, we're looking at foreign terrorism, and yet are we ignoring domestic terrorism?
No, we are not ignoring that.
So are we allocating the equal or more resources to domestic versus foreign? Yes or no? Or
Congressman, we allocate our resources based upon the threats and where the federal government should deploy those resources. And again, it's a very dynamic daily evaluation as to where the threats are, and I believe we are adequately resourcing all of the threats, including the ones you described.
do you think domestic terrorism from white extremist groups is on the rise? And do you think we should allocate additional resources to combating these kinds of terrorist attacks in this country?
Congressman, I believe I already answered this question, but I just want to be clear. I agree with the FBI's assessment.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your answer.
Okay, well, I believe with the FBI statement that those crimes are on the rise. I also believe that we have adequately deployed our resources on a daily basis, dynamically, as required by those threats. And I have seen it based on my intelligence briefings that I participate on almost a daily basis. And I know that the FBI and the other federal law enforcement agencies are adequately resourcing these threats in addition to all the other threats we face. It is a target-rich environment when it comes to law enforcement and making sure that
Sir, I'm running out of time. I'm going to say we're going to continue to look at this in Homeland Security because I believe that we're missing the ball here. In 2017, DHS terminated grant funding to look at some of these issues of domestic terrorism. We have to keep addressing this issue. Lives, the safety of our citizens is at stake. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Ms. Scanlon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Whitaker.
Good afternoon.
In response to a question from my Pennsylvania colleague, you mentioned that the Department of Justice has been attempting to withhold federal dollars from so-called sanctuary cities. Is that right?
Well, yes, I talked about the burn jag grants.
Thank you. And one of those cities is Philadelphia, right?
I believe so, yes.
I happen to represent Philadelphia. Isn't it true that Judge Mike Bailson of the Eastern District of Pennsylvania ruled that the Department of Justice's attempt to withhold this money was illegal and unconstitutional?
Congresswoman, that is the...
Isn't it correct that that was the ruling of the federal court?
Congresswoman, I am not going to discuss an ongoing litigation.
Isn't it correct that the federal court ruled that the Department of Justice's action was illegal and unconstitutional? That's a matter of public record, sir. Is it correct?
Congresswoman, I don't disagree that a district court judge
You may be confused here. This may appear to be a contact sport, but it's not a gridiron, and I'm not letting you run out the time, okay? Isn't it true the federal court ruled that that was illegal and unconstitutional?
Congresswoman, again,
okay, I'll take that as a yes.
Ongoing litigation.
Isn't it also true, Mr. Whitaker? Mr. Whitaker, I'm asking the question. Isn't it also true that the court found that the Department of Justice had not produced any credible evidence that undocumented immigrants committed crime at a higher rate than any other group?
Congresswoman, this is the subject of ongoing litigation.
Isn't it true that the federal court found that in a public opinion?
Congresswoman, I am not going to comment on
okay, I'll take that as a yes as well. Let's move on to some other questions. And just to be clear, I'm asking oversight questions about your enforcement priorities during your tenure, okay, at the Department of Justice. I want to make sure we're clear on when that tenure began. I have a date of September 22nd, 2017 that you became Chief of Staff. Is that correct?
That is incorrect.
Okay, when is your first working date as Chief of Staff for Attorney General?
I started at the Department of Justice on October 4th of 2017.
Okay. And then you became acting Attorney General as of November 7th, 2018?
The President tweeted that I was going to be the next acting Attorney General on November 7th of 2018. The order that I have received from the President has the date of November 8th of 2018.
Okay. Do you have a copy of that order?
I do have a copy of that order.
Can you provide it to the committee, please?
I'd be happy to. I don't have it with me, though, if that's your question.
Okay, that'd be wonderful. Turning to some other enforcement priorities. On December 22nd, 2017, the Department of Justice sent a formal request to the Census Bureau asking for an addition to the census of a question asking about citizenship status. Did Attorney General Sessions direct the department lawyers to draft that request?
Congresswoman, the department is currently defending the Census Bureau in litigation on this issue across the country.
Did Attorney General Sessions ask, or are you refusing to answer the question?
I think it's inappropriate for me to comment about the subject of ongoing litigation.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to reflect that Mr. Whitaker hasn't answered the question, and I'd ask this matter to be addressed in the upcoming deposition. Let's see. Do you know if the president directed Department of Justice lawyers to make that request?
Congresswoman, this is the subject of ongoing litigation.
Okay, so you're not going to answer that question
We are currently defending in the United States court.
Thank you. Was Acting Assistant Attorney General John Gore involved in the drafting of that request to add the census question?
Congresswoman, as I've previously stated, this is the subject of ongoing litigation.
Okay, so we'll let the record reflect that again, you're refusing to answer the question. Okay, we can agree that one of the functions of the Department of Justice is to enforce the Voting Rights Act, correct?
Correct. One of the jobs.
Thank you. And isn't it also true that the most recent Voting Rights Act enforcement action was filed on January 10th, 2017?
As I've mentioned previously, the department is
it correct that the most recent Voting Rights Enforcement Act action filed by your department was in 2017, January 10?
Congresswoman, I'll give you an example.
It's a yes
where
or no
during
question.
the first term of the Obama administration, they filed, I believe, one
reclaiming my time, no running out the clock.
I'm trying to answer your question.
Chairman, if we can enter into the record the Department of Justice website, which reflects when the last Voting Rights Act case was filed, January 10th, 2017.
Without objection, the fact that that is noted on the website will be entered into the record.
Thank you. Isn't it true that under the Trump administration, the Department of Justice has reversed its position on at least 3 important Voting Rights Act cases?
May I answer the question? I see my time has expired.
I think there's a yes or a no.
The Department of Justice...
Gentlelady's time has expired. The witness may answer the question.
Thank you. The Department of Justice has changed positions only in one voting case, and that's the Houston case. The Supreme Court agreed with our new reading of the statute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have about 4 documents I ask for unanimous consent to be entered into the record. The first one is titled Crime and Murder in 2018, a preliminary analysis. The second one reads, border communities have lower crime rates. The third one reads, amid crisis rhetoric, local leaders defend border region from misconceptions. And this is a report from the Rio Grande Valley in Texas. And then the last one is Progressive Times, Mission, Texas, Sheriff. Crime dropped 10% in rural Hidalgo in last year.
Without objection, these documents will be entered into the record. The gentlelady is now recognized for 5 minutes.
So, Mr. Attorney General, what is it in your mind that leads you to conclude that the border region is crime-ridden when these documents that I just entered the record clearly show that Del Rio, Brownsville, El Paso, all the areas in the border region, and in fact even El Paso is listed in the top 29 cities where crime has gone down that you quoted in your written testimony. If all of these stats show differently, why are you still insistent that this is a crime-ridden area? And I just, please, a short answer because I've only got 5 minutes.
I don't recall saying today that the border region is crime-ridden, but I will answer your question as fulsomely as I can. And that is that illegal immigration through our southern border is dramatically and negatively impacting the crime rate in our cities. It would be lower if we didn't have illegal immigration. I point to the example of Molly Tibbetts.
So you're talking about other cities, not the cities there, in fact, in the border areas.
Well, I think you would agree with me that most illegal immigrants that come in through our southern border don't reside at the border region, that they transit through there, then make their way to other parts of our country.
Well, I know many come to Houston because we've got good jobs and we're an open city. But I heard you say earlier, and maybe the word crime-ridden was not the exact word you used, but it was alluding to the fact that the border areas had a lot of crime. And I just simply don't agree with you. But let me move on to another topic in following up on some questions about the family separation policy or the zero tolerance policy. I said earlier in answering a question about some of your background that you were by a General Sessions side for a full year side by side, and you were aware of everything in the Justice Department separation policy. Is that true?
I served as chief of staff for 13 months, and I'm familiar with the zero tolerance policy. Yes, I don't.
Well, but you said you were with him side by side. So, can you tell us if you were in the room when it happened, when the actual zero tolerance policy was hatched?
I participated in discussions about the zero tolerance policy internally, but again, I'm not going to talk about the internal deliberations. The decision was to issue a zero tolerance policy.
But who is the brainchild of the policy? Who hatched it? I mean, where did it come from? We've never had it before, and to the level that it's being executed now.
It was General Sessions' decision to implement, and he signed the memo implementing it and distributed that to our border district U.S. attorneys.
All right, so let me go on and ask this question. How many children are still separated from their families as we sit here today?
That's a number that only DHS and HHS would know. As I sit here, the Department of Justice isn't involved in handling children that are encountered at the border, whether as a family unit or as unaccompanied minors.
So you have no idea how many children might be. You've not seen any documents cross your desk from DHS or ORR or anybody else?
Again, those are different departments within the.
No, I know that, sir, but I know that you're the acting attorney general, and you get a lot of reports, a lot of documents, a lot of data. You've not seen anything to give us any idea just how many children have been torn away from the arms of their mothers.
No, I would have to refer you to HHS and DHS again.
Do you know how many have been reunited with their families?
Again, Congresswoman, those are not statistics that I'm involved in because those cases.
Again, and you don't have to be the one to write the little finger sticks counting the children. I just want to know if you've seen anything cross your desk or any member of your staff, so that Americans who are just find this policy to be abhorrent and inhumane can have an idea as to when the children will ever be reunited with their families. You cannot tell us that today.
No, I would have to refer you to HHS and DHS, which would be responsible for the parts of the process. Because once we receive individuals for prosecution under the zero tolerance policy, we only deal with the adults.
All right, one last question since I'm running out of time. At the State of the Union, the president said that he was going to make, and I'm paraphrasing, a priority to make sure that people with pre-existing conditions were protected. Does that mean that you're going to drop all the ACA litigation that you're involved in?
As you know, Congresswoman, the Affordable Care Act litigation is ongoing in the. Well,
I know that. The question is, are you going to be willing to settle it? Are you going to be able to drop some of that since the president is changing priorities and direction for his Department of Justice?
The time of the gentlelady has expired. The witness may answer the question.
We have a unitary executive, and if the president sets a policy and issues a policy directive, we will follow that policy.
Thank you.
Mr. Neguse.
Mr. Attorney General, thank you for being here. I also want to thank my colleague, the distinguished gentleman from South Dakota, on the other side of the aisle, for his support of criminal justice reform, and looking forward to working with him.
North Dakota.
North Dakota, my apologies. I look forward to working with him on criminal justice reform. I want to talk about another policy matter with respect to cannabis. I represent the state of Colorado. In Colorado, recreational use of marijuana was legalized in 2014. Today, more than half the states have legalized either the recreational or medical use of marijuana. Researchers at the University of Colorado, which I'm proud to represent, are working hard to understand the health effects. They're studying promising approaches that use marijuana to relieve chronic pain and the symptoms of Parkinson's disease. In August of 2016, I understand this is before you were at the Department of Justice, Mr. Attorney General, the DEA took a big step towards improving scientific research on marijuana when it submitted a request in the Federal Register for applications to produce federally approved research-grade marijuana. Several institutions have submitted an application that have yet to receive a response. What is the status of those applications, if you might know, and do you know if the Department of Justice and the DEA intend to support legitimate cannabis research that can help protect the health and safety of our citizens?
For the 3 months that I've been the acting attorney general, this is an issue that I've been aware of, and I've actually tried to get the expansion and the applications out. We have run into a very complicated matter regarding a treaty that we're trying to work around. We have some international treaty obligations that may not allow the way that marijuana has to be handled, from the research facilities to the researchers, or the grow facility to the researchers. And so it is something that I am very aware of. It's something I'm trying to push. Unfortunately, I have 6 days left in this chair at the most. I don't know if I'm going to successfully get to it, but I understand the concern and know that we're trying to make it work.
I appreciate that and I applaud that. And if I could get your assurances that within the 6 days, if you could just follow up with the department staff to follow up with our office in writing, it'd be incredibly helpful for us as folks reach out. So.
Yeah, we'll try to get an answer as to the current status, but in my recollection of where I last found it is that the
sure, no, that's sufficient. I want to make sure I get. Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. You mentioned earlier that the public essentially learned that Attorney General Sessions was fired on November 7th, 2018 by tweet, and you were appointed via that same tweet. When did you first learn that Mr. Sessions was fired or would be fired?
I learned on November 7th, if that's your question. I mean, yeah, okay.
Okay,
yeah.
So you learned by virtue of that same tweet that we all learned?
I mean, I would suggest the only point I'd put on that, Congressman, I'm sorry to interrupt, but is that Mr. Sessions resigned, sent in his resignation letter.
Understand. So did you have any conversations with folks at the White House prior to November 7th, 2018 about Attorney General Sessions resigning or being fired, however you would characterize that?
As is the longstanding practice of the Department of Justice and the executive branch generally, the president's entitled to confidential communications, and while I'm not confirming or denying the existence of any conversation, I'm not going to talk about my private conversations with the President of the United States.
We will follow up on that front with respect, or would ask the chairman to take that up in a deposition to the extent that one is noticed. Question around, you mentioned earlier in some of your testimony around the reasoning behind your appointment, that one of the reasons you believed in your view that you were appointed was to the position of acting attorney general was your experience as a former U.S. attorney, correct?
Yeah, correct. I spent 5.5 years as United States Attorney for the Southern District of Iowa.
Yes, sir. And you also mentioned that one of the reasons in your view that you believed you were appointed acting Attorney General was that you've been at the Department of Justice for the last year or so, working as the Chief of Staff to Attorney General Sessions, side by side, I think you mentioned.
Yes, and I knew all of the active matters that we weren't recused from, obviously. I knew all the policies that we had not only implemented, but that were in progress. I knew all the people and the individuals, both inside the Department of Justice and the interagency.
Understand. I just want to reclaim my time here. So I appreciate that, and I guess the question I have is, I'm sure you're aware that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein is a former U.S. attorney, that he also has been at the Department of Justice, that he knows the people, he knows the matters, and that under the Vacancy Act, he was next in line in succession to be appointed Attorney General in the occasion in which that office was vacant, occasioned by termination or resignation or what have you. And so I'm trying to understand why. I mean, were you surprised that you were appointed rather than Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, that the ordinary rules of succession weren't followed?
It's been an honor of a lifetime to serve as the acting Attorney General, and I have, as I mentioned, 6 days left, and I'm going to take full advantage of that, including enjoying this hearing. But, there are two different statutes that applied to the vacancy that was created by General Sessions' letter of resignation. And one was the succession statute by the Department of Justice, and as you know, the other one is the Vacancy Reform Act, which has been passed by Congress. And so my appointment, as is outlined in the 20-page OLC opinion, is legitimate and has precedent.
And I'm not, with respect to Attorney General, I was not referencing the legitimacy of the appointment. What I was saying is under the Vacancies Act, 28 U.S.C. 508, the Deputy Attorney General is the first assistant to the Attorney General, and so therefore would be the appropriate designee to fill that role. But with that, I yield back the time.
The gentleman is yielded back.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I just wanted to address that issue really quickly, just so we're all on the same page. The first assistant, together with any other Senate-confirmed individual, together with anyone that's served 90 days or less, 365 days at a senior position, is eligible to be, and there's no ranking or hierarchy of those three positions. Obviously, I'm in the third bucket as Chief of Staff. I just want to make sure we're clear on that.
Thank you. Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Whitaker, I'm completely aware that North Carolina and Georgia were dealing with similar problems with voter suppression, and I can actually tell you I witnessed voter suppression firsthand in Georgia, even as I was running in my own election. Is it fair to say that the department was not remotely interested in securing the elections in North Carolina, rather that its intent was abusing its subpoena powers and wielding its mandate to protect our elections in a thinly veiled effort to suppress minority elections and populations?
The Department of Justice is committed to upholding the voting rights of all Americans.
I understand that. But what I need you to clarify for me is what actions were taken for all of the voting rights to be upheld? Because you stated earlier, your statement earlier was that you were side by side with with Attorney General Sessions, advising him on all aspects of the department. Yet you don't know, but at this point you're saying you do not suspect that there was any voter suppression. So what I'm asking is that, do you not know of any voter suppression, or do you not know whether or not those laws are being enforced?
I don't believe I said that I'm not aware that there might have been voter suppression. Is that something you heard me say?
No, I'm just asking you, might it be the case that you were not aware of any voter suppression?
Well, as the Department of Justice, I sit atop a massive organization, as you can imagine, and cases regarding voter suppression, voter fraud, or really any enforcement of the Voting Rights Act or other statutes is done by U.S. attorneys and FBI agents that are in the district doing those cases. And so it would be unusual that I would have specific knowledge about any of the evidence in those cases. So, obviously, we do our cases free of political interference, and if there is evidence of, as you suggest, voter suppression, and we can predicate an investigation, that is something we will seriously look at.
So did the department assess the need for election monitors in the 2019 elections?
I think I mentioned in my opening statement that we sent out 35 Civil Rights Divisions teams to, I believe, 19 states, if I remember right. I might be wrong, and I'd refer you back to my statement, but we did send out election monitors from the Civil Rights Division. Okay,
because I was in Georgia, and I can tell you, I saw the problems, but I didn't see the election monitors. Did you send any that you were aware of?
As I sit here today, I do not know if Georgia received what I'm describing. Obviously, the Civil Rights Division would have determined where those assets could be deployed. I know in the 2004 election, when I was U.S. Attorney, the Civil Rights Division sent, I think, 3 or 4 lawyers to my office to monitor the elections in Des Moines. So I wouldn't be surprised that they did send election monitors to Georgia.
Well, I can tell you, I really think that we needed them. And I'm very disappointed in the numbers that we received. We needed far more help than we got. But also on February 1st, the committee sent you a letter asking again for information on the department's voting rights enforcement. And these questions were asked by members during the 115th Congress, but were never answered. Will you commit to providing this information for this committee?
We try to respond to all the letters we receive from Congress. Obviously, February 1st was, I believe, only a week or so ago. I've kind of lost track of what day it is. But yeah, I mean, we will look at that letter and we will respond consistent with the way we respond to requests from Congress. But I mean, these are important issues, and I share your concern about some of these places where there is alleged voter suppression. And I know that we are going to enforce the the Voting Rights Act robustly, and we will continue. Again, if there is evidence, we should get that to our FBI and the people that enforce these laws so we can properly predicate an investigation.
Okay, well, thank you for that, because if we don't get answers, I promise you we'll keep asking. Another question that I have is, let's see here. No. What steps did the department take to support election security efforts during the 2018 election? Specific efforts.
Are you talking about the actual voting devices?
Yes.
Or the responsibility for the security of the voting devices and machines is actually the responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security?
Mm-hmm. Can you tell this committee what those what those responsibilities were, those steps that were actually taken, because I can tell you there were many, many instances in Georgia we saw over and over again where people were not allowed to vote.
The time of the gentlelady has expired. The witness may answer the question.
Again, if there's specific evidence that crimes have been committed, we would be very interested in that at the Department of Justice.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stanton. Mr. Stanton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Mr. Whitaker. Thank you for appearing before us here today. Your time as Acting Attorney General is near end. After that, you may or may not be working for Department of Justice or another position within the Trump administration, but there are, of course, several congressional investigations that involve yourself. And I want you here today to pledge that you will answer any Inspector General questions and cooperate fully with his investigations even after you depart from your current position.
There's a word, the conversations.
Are you talking about the DOJ Office of Inspector General?
Yes, the Justice Department's Inspector General is currently considering several congressional requests for information and investigations that involve you. Since you'll be leaving this position soon, I want you to commit here today in front of this committee that use questions and cooperate fully with those investigations.
I'm happy to commit to that. I will cooperate with the Inspector General. Michael Horowitz is a fine DOJ career employee. I have the utmost respect for him. I think he's done exceptional work.
Excellent. Thank you so much. The impact of the government shutdown on the functioning of the Department of Justice, the law enforcement functions. Is it fair to say that the shutdown was devastating on the ability of the department to do their work?
The shutdown really was a difficult time at the Department of Justice because most of our employees are law enforcement and are accepted in their performance of their duties, and so they showed up every day like dedicated public servants and did their job, knowing that you here in Congress would ultimately pay them and come to some resolution of the shutdown.
We appreciate your recognition of that. I think every person up here in a bipartisan way would agree that the work of the rank and file members of the Department of Justice, FBI, the other law enforcement officials is outstanding. It seems appropriate then that the department did issue a memorandum saying that during the time of the shutdown, ancillary functions of the department that involve travel would be not allowed. Is that accurate?
I don't have that memo in front of me, but that is consistent with my understanding of our guidance in that regard.
On January 13th, 2019, in the middle of the government shutdown, did you travel to give a speech to the Heritage Foundation?
Congressman, this is an important question, but I want to be very clear. I have 24/7 security detail that drives me everywhere. And so the term travel, I'm not sure what you mean. I went to Capitol Hill to give a speech to the Heritage Foundation, yes.
Okay. Would you consider that activity, a speech to the Heritage Foundation, to be an ancillary function of the department?
Congressman, again, I had no other way to get to a speech that I had committed to give before the shutdown.
Thank you. The speech involved the topic of RFRA and the commemorate RFRA. In October 2017, during the time that you were Chief of Staff to the Attorney General, the Attorney General's office did issue guidance on federal law for religious liberty. The guidance involved expansion of exemptions to RFRA. At a religious liberty summit held in summer of 2018, Attorney General Sessions announced the formation of the Religious Liberty Task Force to further coordinate implementation of the guidance across the federal departments and agencies. It's fair to say that there's been limited public information on the task force and its work. The only public documentation is a 2-page memorandum issued establishing task force. Are you aware of any additional documents or guidance that further explain the task force mandate and processes?
No, I'm not familiar with any additional.
Do you know what the budget is of the task force?
I do not believe, as I sit here today, that we've actually effectuated the task force yet, and so I don't. It's going to be an internal task force that would come that would have no specific separate budget.
Will you commit that during the remaining time that you're acting Attorney General to provide to this committee any additional details regarding that task force? Which has been in place now for, I guess, 7 months or more?
Yes, Congressman, I will be happy to follow up in writing with you or someone from the Office of Legislative Affairs about that Religious Liberty Task Force.
Recently, HHS interpreted the RFRA to allow a Christian-based foster care agency that does receive federal tax dollars to discriminate against potential foster parent because they happen to be Jewish. Do you know if the Justice Department stands behind this HHS determination that a taxpayer-subsidized organization can discriminate against a Jewish individual?
I am certain that the Department of Justice will defend that position of a sister agency.
Thank you very much.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Whitaker, for agreeing to appear before us today. And I'm delighted to hear of your department's focus on the scourge of gun violence, and so I look forward to your full endorsement and support for H.R. 8, the Universal Background Check Bill. Today you said a couple of things that really touched me. You said that you have to set the tone of the department, and you said that the job you are doing now is the honor of a lifetime. All of us here can quite imagine that. I believe that actually you do, as the head, as the acting AG, set the tone for the department. Tell me, and this is not a negative question, it is just a factual question, how many positions did you interview for with this administration prior to you going to the Department of Justice?
As we previously explored with one of your colleagues, I had interviewed preliminarily for the position that ultimately Ty Cobb occupied, and then Emmett Flood, I think, currently occupies. And then I interviewed with General Sessions and some of his staff for the chief of staff job. So, in fact, I had never, after the election of 2016, I had never intended to come into the administration, but I was happy to be asked, and I explored opportunities, and those are the two that I interviewed for.
And in the meantime, in your private life, you became a commentator on CNN and other places, and you disparaged the Mueller investigation. Is that true?
I used my experience as a
Is it true, yes or no?
No, I wouldn't characterize it as disparagement, no. I think I tried to explain to the American people when I was on CNN and other outlets how the process worked, how the process for appointment, how the process for...
No, I'm not asking you about process. I'm asking you about the subject and the investigation and the validity of the investigation. We know, the record is public, that you did say very negative things in your private life, and you have said today you're not willing to take those back, so they stand. Your thoughts on the Mueller investigation are fully public, and they stand because you did not take them back today. How did you learn of the extraordinary honor that was bestowed upon you? How'd you learn you got the job?
You know, I can't remember if it was which preceded which, but I believe I received a phone call from the President of the United States asking me to be the acting Attorney General.
A moment ago you said you learned by tweet. Did I misunderstand you?
Yeah, I think you did.
Okay, so you learned first by a phone call from the President.
I believe so, but they were very close in time, and so I actually, as I sit here right now, I can't remember which preceded which.
Okay, and how long was that phone call? Was it just simply, I'm letting you know of this, or was there substantive conversation about your role?
While I'm not going to discuss the private conversations I've had with the President, I think it's important that he is entitled to that confidentiality from a cabinet secretary, even acting like I am.
Okay,
I will tell you that it was not a substantive phone call.
It was an honor phone call, probably. And following that and the tweet, when did you next meet with the President about your job? Because it's during this time you have to decide, it's during this time, in that month or more, that you have to decide whether or not to recuse, am I right? So how many times did you meet with the President prior to your decision not to recuse?
Congresswoman, while I'm not going to discuss any meetings that I've had with the President nor conversations, I will tell you that I interact with the President on a regular basis, including after I was appointed acting Attorney General.
You said set the tone for the entire department, and so you had to carefully consider whether or not to recuse yourself from any dealings with Mueller.
I spent 5 weeks considering
determining that. And you got information from two sources that we know of. Career officials at the Justice Department recommended you recuse yourself to avoid the appearance of a conflict or bias. Is that correct? And that was on December 19th. To avoid even the appearance of a conflict or bias based on your previous statements. Is that correct? Is that the advice you got?
Congresswoman,
It's a yes or no. Please, my time is running out.
Congresswoman, I would just point you to the
and
letter.
I've waited a long time. Please, it's a yes or no.
This question is not a yes or no question because you have to understand how it was my decision to make. The career ethics officials.
I'm not talking about your decision. I'm talking about the guidance that you received, and not your decision. It was not their decision to make. No. I'm asking you factually about the guidance you received. Career officials told you you should recuse to avoid even the appearance of an impropriety, a bias, and you set the tone for your department. Am I correct?
Congresswoman, they told me it was a close call. They said it could go either way. And they said—
So to set the tone, you think on a close call, you go the other way?
As the Attorney General, and not to bind my successors, yes, I believe on a close call, as the Attorney General of the United States, that I made the right decision. It was my decision to make.
And yet you had career— Have I lost my time, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, get this question out. I'll let him answer it. That'll be that.
Would you be able to provide us the written guidance that you got from the career professionals in terms of recusal? They recommended recusal. Would you please provide this committee that written document?
Congresswoman, that would require me to provide you internal deliberations that are not typically provided in this relationship, but I can tell you, as we sit here today, I did not receive any written advice from the career ethics officials.
Time of the gentlelady has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Ms. McCarcel-Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Whitaker, I want to go back to your time when you worked for the Foundation for Accountability and Civil Trust. I worked for many, many years for various 501c3s. So it's very interesting to me when I look at the board. Is this a private or a public foundation?
Do a roll call vote.
Fact. Was that the 501c3? Is it a private or a public?
I don't know.
There are two separate types.
Congresswoman, I don't have the 990 filings or—
But you worked there from 2014 to 2017.
I was.
And you were the executive director for the foundation.
Yes, I was.
But you don't know if it's a private or a public.
I haven't worked for FACT in 16 months, and in my preparation for this oversight hearing,
Mr. Whitaker.
I didn't review the filings, so I don't know which box we
Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. Thank you. Were there only 3 board members in this 501c3?
I believe there were 3 board members.
William Gustav, Neil Corkery, Matthew Whitaker, correct?
Yep.
Okay. So it's also my understanding that you filed numerous FEC complaints while working there?
All of our complaints were posted online.
Were they FEC complaints, Mr. Whitaker? You filed FEC complaints.
We filed many different types of complaints.
Did you file FEC complaints? You worked as the executive director of this 501c3. Yeah. Did you file FEC complaints? Very easy.
Yes,
okay,
we filed FEC complaints in addition to others.
And who made the decision to file these complaints?
I was the executive director. I believe I signed all, if not all, of those.
Did you make the sole decision to file these complaints, or were you directed?
No, I was not directed. I was.
You did that on your own?
Yes, we were an independent, nonpartisan.
501c3, nonpartisan.
Ethics watchdog.
It's a nonpartisan. Did you file any FEC complaints against any Republicans?
As I sit here today, I don't recall, but I mean, all of our complaints are posted online.
Thank you, Mr. Whitaker. I would like to ask for unanimous consent to make part of the restriction of political campaign intervention by Section 501c3 tax-exempt organizations, and it reads, under the Internal Revenue Code, all Section 501c3 organizations are absolutely prohibited from directly or indirectly participating in or intervening in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate or for elective public office.
Without objection.
Thank you. I have some other questions here, if you give me some time. All this time I'm waiting and I can't find the questions. No. Thank you. This pertains to also an issue that's very close and dear to my heart, LGBTQ issues. In October 2017, the Department of Justice withdrew a 2014 memo, which stated that the best reading of the Title VIII's Title VII's prohibition on sex discrimination in the workplace encompasses anti-transgender discrimination. The new memo instructs the Department of Justice attorneys to now argue that federal law does not protect transgender workers from discrimination. Are you familiar with both memos?
Yes, I am familiar with those memos that do not extend Title VII to LGBT.
Thank you. And at the time of the reversal, were you serving as the Chief of Staff for Attorney General Sessions, correct?
I served as Chief of Staff from October 4th of 2017 until I was appointed Acting Attorney General in 2018.
So who ordered the reversal of this policy?
I'm certain it was Attorney General Sessions who sets the entire policy for the Department of Justice.
And who drafted the new memo?
I don't have, as I sit here today, I don't have any idea. That would be deliberative work done by, I'm sure, many people at the Department of Justice.
Any outside groups that were involved in the process?
Not that I'm aware of, but again, I wasn't
And
directly.
do you stand by the department's decision to reverse its position that Title VII protects transgender people from discrimination?
Congresswoman, I think a plain
Please just
reading.
answer the question. Do you stand by the department's decision to reverse its position that Title VII protects transgender people from discrimination?
If Congress wants Title VII to extend to transgender people, you can change the law. We cannot read into something that is not.
Okay, so I take that yes, okay. Do you believe that members of the LGBT community should not be protected under federal discrimination laws?
Again, Congresswoman, I personally believe that discrimination
Mr.
of any
Whitaker.
kind shouldn't happen,
Yes
but I will
or
tell
no,
you
please.
that Title
I don't have
VII
much time. Do you believe that members of the LGBT community should not be protected under federal discrimination laws?
The plain
Yes or
reading,
no?
The plain reading
Yes or no?
of Title VII
Yes or no?
does not extend
Okay, thank you.
to transgender, and you uniquely control what is the law. We merely enforce the law.
Do I still have time, Mr. Chairman?
Gentlelady's time has expired. Ms. Escobar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Whitaker, this hearing began this morning at 9:30. I've been waiting almost 6 hours. It's nearly 3:30 in the afternoon. I've been waiting nearly 6 hours to ask my questions. I'm going to ask you for a favor. Out of respect for this committee, out of respect for me as a member of Congress, I'm going to ask that you try not to run out the clock, and that you please answer my questions with a yes or a no. And if I have a follow-up, that you please answer the follow-up as succinctly as possible.
Congresswoman, with all due respect,
sorry, excuse me. If I could,
with all due respect, I'm going to answer your questions.
Sir, I've watched you do that to every member on this committee.
Because
I'm
a lot of
asking
questions
that
don't
you
have yes, no
please-
answers.
Time belongs to the member.
Thank you. I represent El Paso, Texas. I live on the safe, secure, vibrant U.S.-Mexico border. Unfortunately, my community, one of tremendous goodwill and generosity, has been ground zero for many of this administration's cruel, anti-immigrant, anti-American policies, including family separation, child detention in tents, the ongoing prevention of asylum seekers from stepping foot on American soil at our ports of entry, and in December, the death of 2 immigrant children in U.S. custody. Earlier, you said you believed every life is valuable, and I would hope and assume that that includes the lives of the most vulnerable among us. There is a new policy that is about to, unfortunately, be rolled out in my community called the Migrant Protection Protocol, which I believe is a misnomer for a dangerous and, in some cases, deadly, and I believe also an illegal policy that allows our government to return migrants and asylum seekers back to Mexico while they await their asylum hearing. Here's my question. Because the Department of Justice oversees the Executive Office for Immigration Review, will the Department of Justice ensure that asylum seekers have access to counsel in Mexico in order to allow them to prepare for their hearings? Yes or no?
We're going to continue to follow the policies at EOR that are currently in place.
Will you facilitate, assist, help ensure that asylum seekers have access to legal counsel in Mexico? Yes or no?
Congresswoman, there is a very well-defined process for asylum seekers to obtain counsel, and we're going to continue to follow that. Of course,
Mr. Whitaker, even while they're in Mexico?
as the acting attorney general, I cannot make an assurance, especially regarding what happens in a foreign country. I mean, I know you understand that.
And this is part of the reason why this is such a terrible policy. Another question. About a week after the policy was announced, reports surfaced that immigrant rights advocates and attorneys were denied entry into Mexico. The attorneys said their passports had been flagged, and reports also indicated that this was not an issue on the Mexican side, but it was on the U.S. side. Did the Department of Justice have anything to do with flagging these passports?
Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with the situation you're describing, but I'm happy to look into it and get back to you.
Thank you. Another question related to this issue. Does the Department of Justice have an immigrant advocate watch list?
Congresswoman, I'm not aware of the question you're asking me, the answer to it, so I'm happy to look into it and get back to you, but that's not something that sounds familiar and that I prepared for today.
I look forward to the answers to those questions. Now, switching gears a little bit. At the President's State of the Union address, he claimed that my community, El Paso, Texas, quote, used to have extremely high rates of violent crime, one of the highest in the entire country, end quote, and he claimed that we became one of the safest communities in America because of a wall. Data from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program shows that El Paso has historically been one of the safest communities in the nation, and that we were such long before a wall was constructed. Do you have any reason to disagree with the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting data?
Congresswoman, we use the UCR on a regular, ongoing basis to not only know where our crime hotspots are, but to also put our resources at the Department of Justice.
Sir, that's not my question. Let me repeat my question.
Okay.
Do you have any reason to disagree with the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting data?
Congresswoman, I think the UCR...
do you have any reason, sir, to disagree with your FBI's data?
As I sit here today,
yes
I do not have any reason to disagree with the FBI's data.
Thank you very much. Switching gears again. Did you ever create...
The gentlelady's time has expired. I'll let her finish this one question.
Thank you, Chairman. Did you ever direct the creation of, see, or become aware of the existence of any documents relating to pardons of any individual?
I am aware of documents relating to pardons of individuals, yes.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I'm going to ask one question to follow up on the gentlelady's. Sir, since it is, black letter law that someone in the United States may apply for asylum, that any person who applies for asylum and states a reason, therefore, is entitled to have that claim adjudicated, that person is entitled to legal assistance as that claim is adjudicated. Doesn't it strike you that a policy that says that people who set foot on American soil and claim asylum will be sent to a foreign country where they may not have access to legal help, which they are constitutionally guaranteed for their asylum adjudication, may have a constitutional problem?
Congressman, I'm sure you're aware that federal law allows asylum seekers to be returned to a safe third country.
I'm not aware, though, that it allows people not that allows the government to do something that effectively eliminates their right to counsel for their asylum claim. This concludes today's hearing. I want to thank all the members who are still here for their patience and their fortitude. I want to thank Attorney General Whitaker for appearing today.
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Jackson-Lee.
Thank you. I'm not asking, I'm putting these questions on the record.
Excuse me, submit them for the record.
Yeah, I will sit them for a record regarding.
Without objection, the questions are admitted.
And the article, and three articles for the record, GQ, Washington Post, New York Times, and also an article by Shane Croucher.
Without objection, the articles are admitted. Before we adjourn, I want to note for the record that, Mr. Whitaker, that you owe us responses on a number of issues raised here today, responses that we intend to secure, including but not limited to the times and dates you were briefed on the special counsel's investigation, your communications with the president after you received those briefings, the basis for your statement that the special counsel's investigation is reaching its conclusion, and whether you told the special counsel not to take any specific investigative or prosecutorial steps. I would also note that your testimony was at best inconsistent, the topic of your communications with the White House prior to your tenure at the department. It is not credible that you both interviewed for a job handling the president's response to the special counsel's investigation and never conveyed your opinions about that investigation to the White House. We require answers to these questions. I ask the department to work with the committee to provide them. As part of that work, I fully intend to call you back for an interview under subpoena if necessary, and I expect more fulsome answers at that time. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record. And with the thanks of the chairman, the hearing is adjourned.